Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to be diving into something that a lot of you have been asking about the Islamic principle of keeping the truth.
Okay.
We've got a source here, the Islamic principle of keeping the truth, and it really goes in depth, pulling from the Quran hadiths and a lot of interesting commentary.
Yeah.
And, we're not here to endorse any particular religious viewpoint or anything, but we're just going to unpack what this source tells us about truthfulness within Islam.
That's right. So
Yeah.
it should be a fascinating deep dive.
I think so, yeah. And it's something we all kind of grapple with, right? I mean, we all deal with truth and lies and, kind of navigating that world. So it's relevant to everyone, even if you're not particularly religious, I think.
Absolutely.
So I'm excited to see what we uncover here. One thing that I noticed right away in the source is that truthfulness is presented as not just like a suggestion, it's like a foundational principle in Islam.
Yeah, it really is.
So how would you explain that?
Well, to understand that, I think it helps to know a little bit about the core texts that Muslims rely on. So first you've got the Quran, which Muslims believe to be the word of God, and it's kind of where we find a lot of the key principles.
Right.
And then there are the hadiths, which are collections of the Prophet Muhammad's sayings and actions, which provide a lot more context and examples.
Okay, so it's not just theory, there's a lived aspect to it as well.
Right.
Okay, cool. So where in the Quran do we see this emphasis on truthfulness most clearly?
Well, there are quite a few verses that address it very directly, and they often use really strong language, which I think emphasizes the importance of it. For example, there's a verse in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 42, and it says, "And do not mix the truth with falsehood or conceal the truth while you know it."
Wow. So no mincing words there.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me that it's not just about lying, but also about concealing the truth, which feels even more deliberate.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It really highlights the ethical responsibility to kind of go beyond just not lying, but to actually proactively uphold the truth. And this idea of purity of truth also connects with another verse in Surah Al-Hajj, verse 30, which tells people to avoid the uncleanliness of idols and avoid false statement. So it's almost like dishonesty is being presented as this kind of spiritual contamination.
Whoa, that's powerful. It's not just about following rules. It's like a state of being.
Yeah.
Interesting. But, the source also talks about betrayals and stuff like that. So does the Quran touch on that aspect of truthfulness?
Absolutely. In fact, in Surah Al-Anfal, verse 27, it warns against betraying Allah and the messenger,
Right.
but also against betraying trusts, which is where it gets really applicable to our everyday life, Think of the trust we place in our friends, our family, our colleagues.
Right.
To break that trust through dishonesty is a major violation.
So it becomes about more than just personal morality. It's about how our dishonesty can impact other people.
Right. It's almost like a social contract in a way.
Yeah, interesting. And this concept is echoed in the hadiths, right?
All right.
Which often give more specific advice, I
Yes.
guess.
Exactly. They kind of flesh it out a little bit more and give examples of what it looks like in real life.
Cool.
Uh-huh.
What kind of guidance do the hadiths offer?
Well, there's one that really stands out, and it says, "Truthfulness leads to righteousness, and righteousness leads to paradise. A man continues to tell the truth until he is recorded with Allah as a truthful person." And it's important to understand that in Islam, paradise isn't just like a physical place, but it represents the ultimate spiritual fulfillment and closeness to God.
Okay, so truthfulness isn't just about avoiding some kind of punishment.
Right.
It's a path towards something good.
Yeah.
That's a really nice way to frame it.
Yeah.
And what about the flip side? What do the hadiths say about dishonesty?
Well, there's another one that states that beware of lying, for lying leads to wickedness, and wickedness leads to hellfire. Now, again, just as paradise isn't simply a physical place, hellfire represents that ultimate state of spiritual separation from God.
Okay, so those are some pretty stark contrasts.
They are.
But it's vivid imagery, right? It makes it very clear what the stakes are.
Yeah, it kind of makes these abstract concepts more relatable in a way.
Absolutely. So how do these big concepts translate into daily life? Does the source tell us how to actually be more truthful?
It does. It breaks it down into three main practices: self-reflection, seeking knowledge, and building trust. And what's interesting is that those three things are all interconnected.
Okay, let's break that down. Self-reflection. What does that look like in the context of truthfulness?
Well, the source talks about the importance of regularly examining your intentions and your actions. Are you being truthful even when no one's watching? Are your words aligned with your true thoughts and feelings?
Right.
It's about holding yourself accountable to a higher standard.
Yeah, and it sounds like it goes deeper than just not telling lies.
Yeah.
It's like cultivating an honest way of being in the world.
Exactly.
Interesting. What about seeking knowledge? How does that tie into truthfulness?
Well, in this context, it's about actively learning about what Islam teaches regarding truthfulness and why it's so important. Because it's not enough to just blindly follow rules. You need to understand the why behind them to truly embrace the principle.
I can see that. Yeah, and building trust. I mean,
Yeah.
it seems like a natural outcome of the first two, right?
Absolutely.
If you're honest with yourself and you're actively seeking knowledge,
Yeah.
it kind of creates a foundation of trust.
It does, and the source emphasizes being truthful in all of your interactions to kind of foster that culture of trust and respect.
Mm-hmm.
When you're honest with others, it encourages them to be honest with you, and that can have a ripple effect on entire communities.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got this foundation of truthfulness, how you interact with people in your personal life. But the source also goes into some pretty complex ideas.
Right.
There's a whole section called Additional Muslim Perspectives About Truth. And that's kind of what I want to dig into now.
Okay, yeah, that section is where it gets really fascinating because it kind of shows how this simple concept of truthfulness can have all these layers.
Right.
For example, the source talks about the absolute nature of truth in Islam.
Okay, so help me understand that. What does it mean for truth to be absolute?
Well, in this context, it means that truth isn't relative or subjective.
Okay.
Like, it's not just someone's opinion.
Right.
It's viewed as an objective reality that exists independent of our individual perspectives.
So it's not like my truth versus your truth. It's like there's a universal truth.
Exactly. It's believed to come from God, ultimately.
Oh, wow. That seems tricky in a world where everyone has different beliefs and experiences.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's something that Islamic scholars have debated for centuries. But within the framework of Islam, this absolute truth provides kind of clear guidelines for what is considered right and wrong, truthful and false.
Okay, so it's like a moral compass almost.
You could say that, yeah, it forms the basis for ethical decision-making.
Gotcha. But if truth is absolute, does that mean there are never any exceptions to this rule about not lying?
Well, that's a good question, and the source does mention some very specific exceptions.
Okay.
But these are discussed very carefully because it's not something to be taken lightly. One example they give is the classic scenario of protecting an innocent life.
Okay.
So let's say someone is in danger and you know where they are. You might be permitted to lie in order to protect them.
I see. So it's like the potential harm of telling the truth outweighs the moral obligation in that very specific case.
Exactly.
Gotcha. I'm assuming those situations are pretty rare, though.
They are, yeah. And the source makes it very clear that this isn't about just lying whenever it's convenient.
Right.
These exceptions are really meant for those extreme cases where there's this direct conflict between upholding the truth and preventing serious harm.
Right. So you have to really weigh the consequences carefully.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's interesting because, we often think about ethics as black and white, but it shows that there's a lot of gray area sometimes.
Definitely.
Okay, so speaking of tricky situations, the source also talks about how Muslims should handle differences of opinion, even when everyone's trying to uphold this idea of absolute truth.
Right, because even with this shared belief in the Quran and the Hadiths, there can be different interpretations and applications of those teachings.
Sure.
And the source really emphasizes that those differences should be approached through respectful dialogue,
Right.
always keeping in mind these principles of truth and justice.
So it's not about forcing everyone to agree, but it's about having those tough conversations, honestly.
Exactly, and trying to understand each other's perspectives, even if you don't see eye to eye.
It's a mature way to approach disagreements.
I think so, and it really speaks to the deeper goal, which is about fostering a society where truth and justice prevail.
Yeah, and where you can have these challenging conversations without resorting to manipulation or dishonesty.
Exactly.
Wow. It's interesting how this principle of truthfulness extends beyond individual actions
Right.
to like how a whole community functions.
It does, and that idea is woven throughout Islamic teachings. In fact, the Prophet Muhammad is quoted as saying, "The best of you are those who are best in character." That's a pretty high bar.
Oh, yeah, it is.
But it shows how central this idea of personal conduct is to the Islamic faith.
It's not just about outward rituals. It's about how you live your life on a daily basis.
Exactly. And truthfulness is a huge part of that.
Yeah, for sure. But it's not always easy, is it?
Well, no, it's not. But the source makes a compelling argument that it's definitely worth striving for. And there's this really interesting idea presented that by embracing truthfulness, you're not just being a good person. you're actually participating in something bigger,
Okay.
something that can transform both yourself and the world around you.
So it's not just about being a good person, it's about doing good.
Right. Think about it. Every time you choose to be truthful, even when it's difficult,
Yeah.
you're reinforcing that value in your own life.
Right.
And you might even be inspiring others to do the same.
Yeah, like a ripple effect.
Exactly. But then what happens when truthfulness breaks down, when dishonesty becomes kind of the norm?
Ooh, that's a good question. Does the source touch on that at all?
It does, and it hints at some pretty serious consequences.
Okay, I'm nervous now.
Because if truthfulness is the foundation for trust and justice,
Right.
dishonesty erodes that foundation, and things can start to crumble pretty quickly.
Yeah, no, I can see that.
The source talks about how dishonesty can lead to the breakdown of relationships, corruption in institutions, and ultimately a climate of fear and suspicion.
Yeah, that's pretty bleak.
It is, but it's not hard to see how it could happen.
Yeah.
If you can't trust the information you're getting or the people in positions of power, it creates this chaos and instability.
Absolutely.
Right.
So this principle of truthfulness, it's vital, not just for individuals, but for society as a whole.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that our choices, even those seemingly small ones,
Right.
have consequences that extend way beyond ourselves.
So it's not just about not getting caught in a lie. It's about understanding that honesty or dishonesty shapes the world that we live in.
Precisely. And that's a huge responsibility, but it's also empowering in a way.
Okay.
Because it means that we have the power to choose truthfulness and actually contribute to a more just and harmonious world.
Wow. Okay, we've covered a lot here. The foundation of truthfulness in Islam, the implications for individuals and societies, the challenges.
Right.
It's a lot to think about. I feel like I have a much better understanding of it now, though.
Yeah, me too. And what's really fascinating is that this principle, which is so central to Islam,
Yeah?
it actually resonates with a lot of other ethical and philosophical traditions.
Oh, really?
It speaks to this fundamental human need for honesty, trust, and justice.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners? What do we want them to walk away with from this deep dive?
I think the most important thing is to remember that truthfulness isn't just an abstract ideal. It's a practice, a commitment we make every day in big and small ways. It's about asking ourselves, am I being truthful in my thoughts, my words, and my actions? And how can I contribute to a culture of honesty and integrity in my own life and in the world around me?
Those are great questions to consider. And as our source suggests, the stakes are pretty high.
They are.
Truthfulness is the foundation of trust, understanding, a just and harmonious society.
Absolutely.
It might not always be easy, but as we've seen, it's essential.
Well said.
So to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Islamic principle of keeping the truth. We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking and maybe even a little bit challenging.
I hope so.
And remember, the pursuit of truth is a lifelong endeavor, so keep asking those questions, keep reflecting, and keep choosing honesty, even when it's hard.
Yeah.
Until next time, happy deep diving. Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty here.
Yeah.
How does this, commitment to truthfulness actually play out in a Muslim's life?
Right.
The source talks about a few different areas, and it starts with personal relationships, which makes sense, right? I mean, honesty is kind of the basis for any good relationship.
Absolutely. And the source really emphasizes that this honesty needs to go beyond just avoiding outright lies.
Okay.
It's about being truthful in your words and actions, even when it's hard,
Yeah.
And it discourages things like gossip, backbiting, spreading rumors.
Right.
Instead, it encourages Muslims to speak kindly and truthfully, even if it means having those uncomfortable conversations.
So it's about prioritizing honesty and respect,
Okay.
even if it leads to some awkward moments.
Exactly.
Okay, I can see that. But how does this idea of truthfulness play out in the professional world?
Right. So the source highlights the importance of integrity in all your business dealings.
Okay.
Being honest in your financial transactions, avoiding any kind of deceit or manipulation, and fulfilling your commitments even when no one's watching or holding you accountable.
So it's like that self-reflection thing we were talking about, but applied to work.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
like you're not just following the rules, you're cultivating that inner compass of honesty. Interesting. What about civic engagement, though? How does truthfulness play into being a responsible citizen?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting because the source talks about this duty that Muslims have to speak truth to power. It emphasizes advocating for justice and holding leaders accountable, even if it means challenging authority or going against the grain.
Wow. That's a big one. It's not just about being honest. It's about actively trying to make society better.
Right. It's about recognizing that truthfulness isn't passive.
Yeah.
It's about working to create a just and equitable society.
But that can be risky, can't it?
Yeah.
Speaking truth to power doesn't always go over so well.
You're right. It can be challenging and sometimes even dangerous.
Right.
But the source frames this as a form of trust, a trust that goes beyond your personal relationships to encompass the community and society as a whole.
I see. So it's like that verse in the Quran about not betraying trusts,
Right.
but on an even bigger scale.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we have a responsibility to use our voices to uphold truth and justice for everyone, not just ourselves.
That's a powerful idea. So we've talked about truthfulness from so many angles now, the foundations in Islam, the practical implications for individuals and societies, the challenges.
It's a lot to take in.
It really is.
Yeah.
But I feel like I have a much deeper understanding now.
Me too. And you know what's fascinating to me is that this principle, which is so central to Islam,
Yeah.
it really resonates with so many other ethical and philosophical traditions.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it speaks to this fundamental human need for honesty and trust and justice that I think we all share.
That's a very human thing, isn't it?
It really is.
So for our listeners who have been with us on this journey into truth, what's the one thing we want them to take away?
I think the most important thing is to remember that truthfulness is not just an abstract ideal.
Right.
It's a commitment we make every single day in our thoughts, our words, our actions.
It's about asking those tough questions like, am I being honest with myself?
Exactly.
And how can I create a more honest and just world?
And as our source points out, the stakes are pretty high.
They are.
Because truthfulness is the foundation of trust and understanding and a just and harmonious society.
It's a big deal.
It is a big deal.
And it might not always be easy, but as we've seen, it's absolutely essential.
Well said. It's been great exploring this topic with you.
You too. And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the Islamic principle of keeping the truth. We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking, and maybe even a little challenging. The pursuit of truth is a lifelong journey, so keep asking those questions, keep reflecting, and keep choosing honesty, even when it's hard.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Until next time, happy